It's now my pleasure to announce our first panel, and I see I've done a good job, as was my goal of putting us behind schedule. So two of our board members, Nouriel Roubini and Jim Grant, will be moderated by Felix Salmon of Fusion. Grateful to both of them for being here. If you don't know, Jim, for anybody in the investing world, is an icon, and his magazine, his newsletter, Grant's Interest Rate Observer, is for sure required reading for anybody interested in the markets. And Nouriel doesn't like the nickname Dr. Doom, but he earned it because he predicted the financial crisis, not only that it was coming, but in all of its constituent parts. So when Nouriel starts getting bearish, we run and he's also been named the number 4 of the top 100 global thinkers. The New York Post said of this coming panel, and I quote, "The panel between Roubini, also known as Dr. Doom, and gold bull Jim Grant will be a bit of a showdown," noting their diametrically opposed views on the commodity. So don't let us down, guys. With that, I'll hand it over to Felix, and thanks again for being here.
So I feel like Richard more or less introduced you guys.
Yes.
But yeah, I think, I'm looking down here, I think you have about, a dozen or so books between you. So if you're signing books, that's going to take a while. I honestly think that neither of these guys needs much more introduction from me, because they're both well-known. And I will disagree only with Richard on the question of whether or not Nouriel likes being called Dr. Doom. He loves being called Dr. Doom.
The doctor part you like, right?
Here I feel like Dr. Boom Boom in the middle of this great art, so not Dr. Doom and Gloom.
So we have a short program here, and we're going to try and leave a little bit of time for questions. So we're going to do a sort of supersonic trip around the world and everything, and we're going to start because we have to start with some of the very big sort of rates and macro and that kind of thing. Jim, yeah. U.S. economy, rates, growth.
I would say so, yes.
Like this boom is what, the longest boom in recorded history?
Well, I'm not sure what is booming. Certainly financial asset prices are levitating. Up and down Main Street, there seems to be less of a boom than a kind of a slog. You mentioned interest rates, which for me are kind of a sore point. My publication is called Interest Rate Observer, and you can't see them. They're so tiny.
And you haven't been able to for years.
No. It's become rather a business model problem. But I think apart from that, and of rather more general interest, interest rates, I make bold to say, are the most consequential prices in a market economy. They discount future cash flows and help define credit risk and set investment hurdle rates. And insofar as interest rates are prices, and they are prices, they convey information. But if they are distorted prices, they convey misinformation. And I think that is a central difficulty the world over, the lack of price discovery in this most consequential market.
So what does that mean? Okay, so the rates have been basically zero for years now. Are they going to stay zero for years to come, or is that going to change?
Well, there are rates and rates. The central banks have almost direct control over certain money market interest rates. They have a much more tenuous effect on longer dated securities prices and rates, and they have very little to do with the way that the world ultimately prices the risk of repayment, which is called credit risk. The central banks can create cash balances.
But I guess like, what I'm saying is that all of that is zero. Like credit spreads are very low. Long bond rate is
yes.
zero.
In fact, you can go further than that, Felix, and you can say so I called up the still living co-author of a page turner called The History of Interest Rates. He's Dick Silla of NYU, and his narrative is interest rates from 3000 BC to the present. So that makes 5,000 years. And I said, Dick, I've read many pages, but not every single page of your magnificent book. In the history of interest rates over 5,000, has there ever before been a time in which there were substantially negative nominal yields, meaning the ones you see in the newspaper, on sovereign debt, more than the length of a few months? And he said, no. So we are in the middle of a 5,000-year first in finance. And you can spend your whole career on Wall Street, like a 40-year career, and never once come across a 5,000-year first. It's a very unusual thing, Felix.
So, Nouriel, we just saw Ireland. I mean, negative interest rates
Yeah.
on sovereign debt we've had for a few years now. I think this might be one of the first. We just saw Ireland issuing at a negative rate, which I don't think we've seen in a while. So, this isn't going away anytime soon, right?
No, it's not going away anytime soon because there are, I think, two factors at play. One, of course, monetary policy can affect short rates and through the yield curve, even long-term interest rates. And during the financial crisis, we started not just standard open market operation, but also QE that implies buying long rates and squeezing the term premium. But it's not just monetary policy because in the world, we are also in a world in which there is on one side a global savings glut. On the other side, there is a global investment slump, and therefore the equilibrium real rate for the global economy is where savings meet investment. Investment is low, savings are high, and therefore that equilibrium real interest is also on long-dated securities is very low. So I think it's a combination of these new mediocre or secular stagnation or new abnormal, different people call it different ways. Ray Dalio calls it the great deleveraging and so on, and what's happening with monetary policy. And I think the paradox is actually that unconventional monetary policies are here to stay because, I mean, take even the Fed that is on the process of normalizing. They say if we finish normalizing, we'll have a Fed funds rate at 2.75 in equilibrium, right? A year or two from now. Last time around was 5.25, the previous time was 6.50. So you don't have much headroom. So the next time there's going to be a recession, whether a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, you're going to go from 2.75 to 0. And once you're at 0, you have either to do quantitative easing and forward guidance, or you have to go negative with the policy rate, unless you change your inflation target towards 4 or towards 0. And even in those cases, you're not going to have much action. So I think that the reality is that not only is unconventional monetary policies are here now for the last 10 years, but they're going to come back during the next recession, for sure. Guaranteed for sure. So we live in a world in which these things, whether you like them or not, you can criticize them, are now part of the normal toolkit. They didn't even exist. 10 years ago, we heard the term QE, quantitative easing, or CE credit easing, or FG forward guidance, or ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, or NIRP, negative. Negative is the new normal. That's the world we live in.
So given that that's the world and we can't do anything about it, I guess the corollary of that is that people don't really matter. We saw the extremely unexpected election of Donald Trump, and the effect on the markets was invisible. We saw, we have a new Fed chair coming along, whoever that is going to be. We can assume that the identity of the Fed chair is kind of irrelevant as well, right? Like these things are bigger than individuals.
Well, I agree that this is bigger than individuals. Of course, the rise of Trump, and not just Trump, the Brexit vote, the rise of populist parties of extreme right and left in Europe, but not just in advanced economies. Look at the emerging markets. You have a bunch of authoritarian strong men that are in power, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Kaczynski in Poland, Duterte in Philippines, Orban in Hungary, Maduro, just to name a few, and even President Xi Jinping is an authoritarian. So there is something bigger that is this populist backlash against trade, globalization, migration, supranational authority, that in my view is driven by this rise, among other things, of inequality. It is also driven by, in partly, trade and migration, but in part by also technological innovation, this capital intensive and labor saving, in addition to policy that favor the rich against the poor. So that now we have this bigger phenomenon. So I think Trump is just a manifestation of it. And unless we deal with it, eventually we'll have social and economic consequences that are going to be severe.
But I guess the question I'd have for Jim is like, is there any news about people that is going to make a difference to the markets or to the economy? Or have we now achieved peak sort of uncoupling, and that whatever happens in the news really doesn't seem to have any effect on the global economy or markets?
I'm not a believer in some sort of mystical determinism. It seems to me that individuals do have the capacity to make a very big difference. In the case of the very specific institution we call our central bank, the Federal Reserve, the chairperson, whoever he or she might be, can set for one thing, the nature of the debate. we have come to take it as if it were given that the Fed's role is to administer interest rates in the drive for a satisfactory overall economic policy. Interest rates have been nationalized, and to a degree, asset prices have been nationalized through central bank action. Chairman Bernanke some years ago undertook to, he specifically said, he said, pointed to the Russell small cap index, Russell small and medium cap index, and he said, it's gone up a lot, it's good. So in effect, these asset prices have been suborned in the national interest. We were moving away from price discovery, not only in interest rates, but also in other asset prices. So what happens if we had a new chairman and a new chairman or a new chair got up and said, well, I'm in favor of this, I'm imagining this individual, I'm in favor of free-range interest rates, of farm to table, wholesome, non-GMO interest rates, discovered in the marketplace rather than administered from on high. That would be a very big thing. It would be a very big thing.
Give me a name here. Who might be able to do that?
Well, actually, I'm available.
My view, it doesn't matter who they choose. The Fed used to be an absolute monarchy under Greenspan, became a constitutional monarchy under Ben Bernanke, became a constitutional democracy, under Yellen. And whoever is going to be chosen is going to be at best primus inter pares. And he or she has one vote in a committee where every one of the regional Fed governors have very strong views, and you cannot shut them up. And this administration talks as if they want hard money, but that's bullshit. Yes, in Congress they
Is it a technical term?
Huh?
Is it a technical term?
It is a technical term these days, because there is a lot of bullshit in Washington.
But
the Republicans pretend to be in favor of hard money. And if you go in Congress, you have those, 1/4 of them are gold bugs, want to go back to gold standard. 1/4 of them want rules rather than discretion, a strict Taylor rule. 1/4 of them want single mandate on inflation rather than growth and economic stability. And 1/4 of them want to audit the Fed. That's the Ryan Shelby crowd. But this White House is in favor of low interest rates and low easy credit and low dollar. Because the white blue-collar guys who voted for him want to have jobs and want to have income. And if long rates go much higher and the dollar goes much higher, then Trump is doomed. So they're going to choose whoever, but whoever they're going to choose, and it's not just one, because they're going to choose the next year or so 6 members of the board, they're going to be a bunch of doves. Yeah, they're going to pick one kind of hawk just to give a mop to these guys in Congress, but there'll be a bunch of doves. They're going to do same stuff. And the chair alone can have whatever view is going to be outvoted by everybody else. Everybody else is going to be dovish.
I'm very glad
So we get another effective dove. I mean, if they go for John Taylor, he cannot impose his will. According to the Taylor rule, interest rate should be right now already, Fed funds rate at 3%. He's going to impose that on the committee. They're going to laugh at him, frankly.
Exactly. So we have managed to identify the one place in the world which is becoming more democratic. It's the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve.
No, it's not. It's a double monopoly. First of all, it's monopoly granted by the state. And secondly, there's a kind of an intellectual monopoly or oligarchy having to do with the tenure system in American universities, right? The people who come into the Fed has, 800 PhD economists on the payroll, I think, about that. So they either need 801 or many fewer because it's not working. But the people who...
That is not working. Based on which standard?
Oh, based on the standard of American dynamism, growth, and the like. I think it's not.
Well, a few years ago, I don't know about you, but many others, there was a whole bunch of Republicans wrote a whole petition saying all this quantitative easing and the basic money is going to lead to much higher inflation, much higher long-term interest rates, to collapse of the dollar, collapse of the stock market, and gold going to 5,000. Guess what? Just the opposite happened. Inflation has gone lower, long rates have gone lower, gold has collapsed, and the stock market is booming, and the dollar is stable. So all those doom and gloom turn out to be wrong.
You're the
right economic model.
And
the Fed had the right economic model. It's a mediocre recovery because there are fundamental reasons why potential growth is low. And I would say among all of them, the rise of inequality is one of them. Karl Marx was right. When you shift income from labor to capital, from wages to profits, you have over savings and you have under consumption. That's what's going on in the United States around the world. That's why we have low growth.
Well, I don't think it's a
Instead of reducing the tax on the rich, we should increase the tax on the rich and give it to the poor. Then we'll have more economic growth because we'll have more consumption, more labor income, and more aggregate demand. That's the solution.
Felix, this idea of a savings glut is a curious thing to me. Is it a savings glut or is it a bank credit production glut? Every month, 3 central banks, the Bank of Japan, European Central Bank, and the Swiss National Bank together are producing about $112 billion of new digital script. That's a lot of money, even when you say it fast.
That's awesome. That's great. More money. Great.
Well, you said the central bank can affect short rates, but not long rates. Long rates are very low. So unless it has such a huge effect.
Through arbitrage, of course, short rates have a direct effect on long rates. And in the case of the European Central Bank, it does have an effect on long rates because they're buying them at sub-clearing prices, I would submit.
Yeah.
Ireland the other day comes to market and has 4 billion euros, 5-year notes to sell. And the coupon is 0, and the price is slightly over 100, indicating that the yield to maturity is less than nothing. And do you know that 17% of the demand was accounted for by hedge funds, which charge their clients 2% and 20%. So that's 2% and 20% on less than nothing, which is, I think, in a capsule, the difficulty of this regime of central bank manipulation. It is
But listen,
a great
take the US. They finished QE, they tapered it, then they started raising rates. So you cannot say anymore it's the QE or the low rates. And in spite of that, compared to a year ago, when we ended up QE and we started raising rates, long rates today are much lower than they were a year ago.
Right, so
so there must be something else going on.
Exactly.
That the equilibrium real interest rates in a world in which there is low growth, there's too much savings, there's not enough investment, is a low equilibrium. It cannot just be just that monetary story.
But Jim,
not saying monetary policy did not matter. It's not just monetary.
Let's move away from like the evils of the technocrats and how they should be doing something else and talk about the actual world that we find ourselves in, and how do you, well, let's have this debate about gold, because this was the advertised. Like, in this world that we find ourselves in, are you like gonna, because you're so disgusted with the loose money and the central bankers and all of that, are you therefore deciding that the only safe place, we should be buying art and gold and Bitcoin because those are the only things which don't have cash flows?
No, I mean, I think the price of gold to me is the reciprocal of the world's confidence in the institution of central banking, an institution of national fiat currencies. So the greater the confidence or the complacency toward the institution of central banking, the less relevant gold becomes. Gold is of course, the legacy money. It's got a long history as a monetary asset. It is inconvenient because it's expensive to store and it delivers no income. So people don't hold it except out of a sense either A, that it is money, or B, that it is a better money than the ones that the technocrats are producing. Gold has not, gold is, since the year 2000, it's still outperformed Nouriel stocks and bonds on a total return basis. So it has come off a bit since 2011. But I think that the gold market is waiting to see if Nouriel's prediction on the next time down is correct. Because if the central banks of the world must revert to quantitative easing, 0% interest rates, or negative nominal interest rates, I think people will begin to reconsider the efficacy of these vast, unprecedented exertions in policy.
So what you're saying is...
Well, gold, they peaked at 1900, then went down to 11, 12, where it is right now, in spite of the fact that ECB's continuing its QE and negative policy rate. Same story with BOJ, same story with Riksbank, same story with SMB, same story with most of the central banks. And yeah, the Fed has gone from 0 towards 1, big deal. So I guess that based on that, the markets are trusting central banks.
Correct.
I think that, if we had not done this massive unconventional monetary policy, if we had not learned the lessons of the Great Depression, where a stock market crash became a Great Depression because we had no monetary easing, no fiscal easing, and no backstopping of illiquid but solvent agents, we'd have another Great Depression 2.0. So by that standard, all this unconventional stuff has been very successful because now we have a recovery of economies, however mediocre, even in Europe, even in Japan, let alone the United States. And we have now asset prices higher, and we avoided deflation. So by that standard, ask yourself what was better, ending up in Great Depression 2.0 or in this equilibrium, this
Why
mediocre
is
for lots
the
of reasons,
choice-
but it's a better equilibrium than having another Great Depression.
Why
We could have had another Great
is
Depression,
the choice
literally.
between the 30s and the present? There was a depression in 1920 and 21. The stock market was chopped in half. GDP was down significantly. Commodity prices sawed in half as well. Unemployment was not measured properly, but it was certainly significant. And the policy response was to balance the budget and to raise, not lower interest rates. And that depression was over and done, and a recovery beginning in 18 months. Compare and contrast the 30s, in which Keynesian remedies were applied, to be sure, half-heartedly, but that depression lingered until arguably 1946. It seems
They
to
were
me
not
that
applied between 29 and 33. It was only after we had the Great Depression that finally, we started doing some of that stuff.
well, I do not accept that
and
the only
the
choice
opinion was
between a new Great Depression
liquidate.
and radical policy, and radical policy. I don't accept that. I don't accept the new normal. I don't accept the new mediocre. It seems to me that the policies are wrong. Ergo, Donald Trump is president.
So
Depends
talking
which
about
policies are wrong.
So yeah, I mean, let's expand this out a bit, because it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, the world politically is crazy. The biggest and most influential election, I think, was not Trump. It was Brexit, because that's permanent. Trump, you can change your mind on after 4 years.
Well, Brexit could be reversed. Unlikely, but
okay,
could be
so that's my
reversed,
first question: is what's the probability that Brexit happens?
It's still high, but it could end up being a soft Brexit as opposed to a hard Brexit. I think that, take Boris Johnson, he pretends to be more hard Brexiter than Theresa May because he wants power. But suppose that he comes to power in 6 months from now or earlier, he's going to do a Nixon in China. And then once in power, he's going to say, hey, our Brexit is terrible. We need to do a soft one. I'll keep Hammond. And he's going to take the party with himself. Probably the best thing could happen to the UK. And, if you have a transitional agreement, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it comes 5 years or 10 years, or maybe at some point Labour comes to power and Corbyn is a skeptic, but you never know. I mean, the vote in the recent election says certainly in the UK that the majority of people are not in favor of hard Brexit. And by the way, 3/4 of the young voted for staying in the EU. All the old, with due respect, are going to be gone sooner or later, while the young are going to live with the consequences of the Brexit. Sooner or later, I'm just saying, the old will be gone. So for the next 50 years, there'll be a bunch of young generation, 3/4 of which wanted to stay in Europe. They voted this way during the referendum, and they voted this way during the election. So maybe things will be reversed. Maybe not. I don't know.
Do you think, Jim, like the best case scenario is Prime Minister Boris Johnson? That's terrifying.
I like
Not
Boris.
that terrifying. He's a very smart guy who
I like Boris
pretends to be a
Johnson,
buffoon.
and besides, I live in Brooklyn. I don't know.
He's a brilliant guy, actually. Student of the classics, and he has to, to be populist because the masses want to be populist, so he pretends to be a buffoon, but he's an amazingly smart guy, and it'll be better than Theresa May, for sure.
For sure. U.S. equities. Jim, do you have like, you're a deep value guy. Do you have like, are you picking stocks right here?
I pick fewer of them. The market goes up 5 days a week, and it would go up 7 if it were allowed. It goes up in tiny increments. Volatility is lower than ever before measured. This in the context of depression-level interest rates and valuations that have rarely been so high. In fact, based upon Robert Shiller's trailing so-called cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio, valuations were higher only during the dot-com boom and for a few months in the year 1929. So it's a very curious financial environment, and it's not especially welcoming for those who pay attention to value. Indeed, you can make the case that among the many unique aspects of the present day is the systematic marginalization of the concept of valuation from investment decisions. We count something like $21 trillion worldwide as invested without regard to price and value. This would incorporate ETFs and exchange trade and indexation. You buy the S&P 500 because it's there and not because you have done fundamental research. The central banks buy ETFs, they buy bonds. So there's enormous investing or investment flows that are unconnected in any way to the valuation of the marketplace. And it's a very difficult time for those who, first and foremost, pay attention to value.
Well, I would say there is certainly a meaningful gap that is growing between Wall Street and what asset prices are doing, and mainstream that is growing only 2%. It's true that the profit share has been rising significantly, and earnings have been still quite strong, helped in part by low interest rates. But I would say that there are other forces that imply that capital is strong and labor is weak, whether it's trade, globalization, technological innovation, and you name it. And on top of it, you have policies that are on the regulatory and the tax side biased towards the wealthy, and they're going to become more so. Suppose they do pass a tax cut, it's not tax reform. You reduce the corporate tax rate, you eliminate the state tax, you reduce capital gains, dividend taxes, and all sorts of all those things like this. Hey, the stock market can have another leg up, 5, 10% or more, right? So for the time being, I think if the tax reform or tax cut is passed, markets can go higher. Eventually, I think the gap between Wall Street and Main Street implies that either there's significant pickup of growth or otherwise stocks have to correct. But to correct, you need to have a catalyst. In the last 2 years, there have been only 2 market corrections, August, September of 15, worries about hard landing in China, and January, February of last year, worries about hard landing of China, Fed hiking 4 times that year, US growth stalling, Brexit, all collapsing below 30. So you need something that is a catalyst. Otherwise, CAPE can be 2, 3 standard deviation out of normal, but you're not going to have that correction. And therefore, you need something systemically important happening. It has to be new worries about Chinese hard landing, maybe after the Party Congress. You need to have real political trouble in Europe and something going wrong in Europe. You need to have this Trump policy becoming more crazy. Maybe you do a massive fiscal stimulus, and the Fed reacts by tightening monetary policy, and then you have long rates going higher, dollar going higher, and then it becomes even more protectionist, and maybe starts then wag the tail kind of attack against North Korea. So there is circumstances in which actually you could have a risk-off episode triggered by Trump, and I would say of all the tail risk in the global economy, the biggest one is Trump and his policies, both economic, financial, and geopolitical. But you need that trigger, and the trigger may occur in the next 12 months, but maybe it's not going to occur in the next few months. Markets can go higher before there may be something triggering a correction. And whether it's a correction rather than a real bear market depends on whether that shock is significant enough to derail global economic expansion. Right now, in an expansion path.
So it depends, right?
Yeah, it depends.
It basically depends on whether we have thermonuclear war.
Unless we know exactly the future.
I wanted to clarify that.
So wait, do we have any questions? We have
like everything else. Right. Nothing is unconditional in this world, right?
A question from the audience, if we may, while we try and work out whether or not whether or not Donald Trump is going to declare war.
Is it possible that we're 10 years into a deflationary cycle hidden by extreme monetary policy? Is it more likely that financial assets adjust to the underlying economy as opposed to the underlying economy adjusting to financial policy?
So here's the question for those who didn't hear it. Basically, Nouriel's point about the divergence between the real economy and financial asset prices, which, insofar as they converge, is it going to converge because the real economy finally starts picking up, or because asset prices finally fall? Which one's more likely?
I think eventually the real economy potential growth in the U.S. is only 2%, and anything that they do in terms of tax reform or you name it is not going to increase potential growth and more than 20 basis points. The idea that potential growth could be 3 or 4 is just a joke, really a joke. No serious economist would say anything like this, but they pretend that they can do that. And therefore, even if in this 2% economy, the share of profits goes higher and higher, and therefore valuation can go higher and higher, eventually you have the Marxian underconsumption kind of puzzle that eventually there is too much income going to those who save and not enough to those who spend, and therefore, by itself, that increase in inequality is going to imply slower growth. And once slower growth is going to occur, then equities have to correct. But as I said, for the next 6 months or 12 months, they can go much higher before eventually that correction is going to occur.
Yeah, this was a very interesting question. I like to, and a very nuanced one. So the question was, are we in a kind of cycle? Meaning, is this a deep-rooted tendency of prices to drift lower, even as asset prices work higher? And if it is such a cycle, can this divergence persist? And if it doesn't persist, how is it resolved? But I want to observe about this question about a deflationary cycle. Deflation means, to me at least, it's a phenomenon of debt. Falling prices can be a phenomenon of progress. I mean, prices drifted lower throughout the final quarter of the 19th century, and very few, some did protest, debtors, and some, and certainly William Jennings Bryan protested, but it was a time of prices drifting lower, but real wages working higher. And there weren't really intervention of central banks around to intervene against that trend. Now, so what we have now, we have growing financial leverage the world over, terrific piles of debt, and we have prices that, as measured, are working higher in ways that are not high enough to satisfy the central bankers, which itself is a curious thing, right? I mean, most Americans spend most of the weekend looking for bargains, and the central bankers tell us, no, you may not have them. We don't want prices going lower. They must work higher. They don't say why. Is it because the burden of debt is so intolerable that, except for inflation, we can't service it? Is that the argument? We don't hear it. So I think about your question, sir, all the time. I certainly can't answer it, but in the early 60s, there were 4 or 5 consecutive years in which the CPI had a year-over-year rise of less than 2%, and many years less than 1%, and no one protested. There was no hue and cry about deflation or about secular stagnation or a period of dynamic growth. There was 12 months between 1954 and 55 in which the CPI was actually lower every single month, year over year, and again, nobody said anything. So now we're in this world of terrific financial leverage, of arguably manipulated asset values. And there is this undercurrent of dread and anxiety about deflation when consumer prices are actually, as measured, rising. I mean, your question is powerful and important, and I only wish we could answer it.
Well, if I could add just one point.
Oh, you can answer it.
There can be episodes of, unquote, what Jim refers to as good deflation, where I would say there is a massive, persistent, positive supply shock so that the price level is falling. And there are cases in which you have bad deflation, that is when there's not enough aggregate demand and you are in a depression. Even in the positive cases, you still have the risk of the Fisherian debt deflation problem. In a world in which there is too much private and public debt in nominal terms, the fall in the price leads to an increase in real debts and increases insolvency. So even if it was positive. And secondly, my reading of the last, say, 70, 80 years is that we have had mostly episodes of bad deflation. The Great Depression was not a positive supply shock. We had an unemployment rate at 20, 30%. The stagnation of Japan for 20 years was not a good deflation. The deep recession and deflation in the Eurozone, with unemployment rate going in Spain or Italy or Portugal at 20, 30%, was not a good deflation. So if I'm looking in principle, yeah, I can have good deflations, but I don't think this is episodes of good deflation. It's deflation driven by lack of aggregate demand. In a situation like that, you need to have monetary easing, you need to have fiscal easing, and you need to backstop in solvent but liquid agents. Otherwise, if you follow the motto of the 30s, liquidate, 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 we know what happened. A stock market crash became a Great Depression. Luckily, Ben Bernanke learned the lessons and avoided liquidate, 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 and that's why we have a recovery, however mediocre, and now asset prices are much higher. Economic activity between the beginning of the Great Recession and middle of 2009 was collapsing at the same rate as between 1929 and 31. Output, production, consumption, investment. This recession, this Great Recession, could have ended up into Great Depression 2.0. The reason why it didn't end up as Great Depression 2.0 is we had the policy response. That was the only difference.
This is the preoccupation with the 30s that has dominated our discussions of monetary policy for 10 years. Now, Irving Fisher, to whom Professor Roubini alluded, the great theorist of debt deflation, was on the record in 1921 as saying, 1930, he was on record in 1930 as saying, at last we have learned our lesson. This will be nothing like the Depression of 1920-21. And indeed, to start with, the Depression of 1929, 30, 31, 32, 33, and on was a pale shadow of the rip-roaring and quite frightening liquidation of 1920-21. That liquidation ran its course, and it ran its course in the context of a punishingly high real rate of interest. Now, is it not possible that in the attempt to forestall this dreaded recurrence of the 1930s, that the central banks pressed down interest rates low enough to create the irresistible invitation to borrow and lend such that the burden of debt mounts and mounts, and finally, you are left with a true deflation. Deflation, to me, in essence, is not a phenomenon of aggregate demand. It's a debt phenomenon. As I think Professor Roubini alluded to this as well. It's a phenomenon of debt and unserviceable and unpayable debt. So look what's happened to financial leverage both at the governmental level and the corporate level since 2009. We are well on our way through the mispricing of credit, I say, to a true deflationary risk. It has nothing to do directly with aggregate demand. It has everything to do with the financial markets.
Okay, I think that's more, if we can have a speed question of like 30 seconds each, we can fit it in, but that's it. Has to be a short one.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Grant, you cited a staggering figure, which is that $21 trillion of capital globally is invested in assets really without regard to valuation, and ETFs are one example of that. How does this play out? In other words,
well, we've only got a few seconds. Let me try to take a stab at it. It seems to me that you can kind of imagine people who are investing, and they're investing like $3 billion a day in ETFs and index funds. Bank of Japan, of course, buys these things the same way. Swiss National Bank, ditto. People buy these stocks and bonds without regard to valuation. So they buy them because they're going up. Not central banks, but individuals buy them because they're going up. They rent them, so to speak. You invest for the long term, or you kind of rent for the short term. So the question really is what happens when momentum reverses? It always does. And there was a note yesterday on Bloomberg News. It was very provocative. It was that the big established Wall Street investment banks are leaving the business of making markets in exchange-traded funds, and that business is being ceded to high-frequency traders. So high-frequency traders are making markets in ETFs, and the high-frequency traders, I say, are unlikely to be there doing the noble work of market making during liquidation. So you ask about what the downside might be like. The downside might be swift.
Okay.
Here it says 00.
It says 00. That means on this jolly note of like $21 trillion all exiting at the same time with no market maker to take the other side is the jolly note that we're going to end this thing on. Thank you very much, Jim Grant and Nouriel Roubini.